The final style of music we're going to talk about that developed after 1945 is electronic mixed media music. This is the music of Edgar Varèse and Christophe Penderecki, amongst many, many others, and it's music that not only occurred in the classical modern music era, but became more and more a part of the popular music culture. As we all know, we have music at our fingertips today, and digital music, digitalized music, is very common. Technology in the 20th century has been rapidly developing and evolving. At the beginning of the 20th century, composers saw the first possibilities of recording music. They saw the first ways to actually store music. They used electricity more commonly and were able to then have records, cassette tapes, CDs, etc. at their fingers. Especially mid-century, around 1945, electricity had become so common and things had become cheaper, so composers could afford cassette tapes and synthesizers and computers for the first time. All of these things started to be used by musicians and composers to create new sounds and types of music. Because, of course, new technology made new tone colors. It allowed for the mixing of live and recorded music in performance, and it really created unlimited possibilities for the defining sound and creating new sounds. Because of all the new electronics available, you had not only simple electronic music, music written for electronics, but you also had mixed media. Mixed media was when music was combined with visual arts or aspects of artistry so that audiences could experience music with all their senses. Just as when you would mix live and recorded music in the same setting, they would also combine writing, visual art, architecture, and music together to create a full musical experience. Today, this is very common. Just think of a film. Visually, we're told a story, and in the background, there's always music. That's an example of electronic and mixed medium music. Pop shows today use lighting and music videos and videos of the actual performance so that everyone in those huge arenas can see them. Again, that's mixed media. Mid-century, this was a very new concept and it was very exciting for composers. It really broadened their horizons as to what they could do in performance as well as what they could put on paper and record. One of the things that came out of this new use of electronic equipment in music composition was the idea of the liberation of sound. Composers sometimes went so far as to believe that technology and electronics could be used to create the full musical experience. In other words, you could fully use every one of your senses to understand music at a more fundamental level if technology was incorporated into the composition of music. Composers combined old styles and sounds with more modern concepts in sound, such as expressionism and minimalism, with new technologies. This is a way that they used to redefine the idea and sound of music. The actual term liberation of sound was a term coined by Edgar Varèse, one of the composers we're going to talk about in just a moment. The term came to define music that used any noise, pitch, or sound to create music in new ways. The liberation of sound was the freedom of sound from any rules or regulations or forms. It was the exact opposite, say, of what we talked about in the classical period, when form was the most popular aspect of music. Using the rules is what made you popular. Now, we've gone so far that composers believe that sound must be liberated, and in order to do this, they use electronic and acoustic instruments so that they can alter the music in any way they dream of. They could use anything from screaming, cluster tones, birds, cars, horns honking, anything. Anything that was noise or sound, and they could distort it or alter it in any way they wanted if they used electronic equipment, and they could combine that with the more real acoustic sounds of the typical musical instruments to create liberated sound and liberated music. Of course, as I just mentioned, Edgar Varèse is the man who coined the term liberation of sound. Varèse was a Frenchman, but spent much of his life in the United States. and his deepest wish was to free music from the limitations of traditional instruments and expanding the vocabulary of sound. He wrote a lot of percussion music, was inspired by some of John Cage's music written for percussion, but he also really believed that electronic music was the new music that would be around for hundreds of years to come. And he was right. Most popular music today is entirely based first off of electronic mixing and electronic instruments, and then off of the more acoustic and vocal musics. Varèse was one of the first to try and create the full musical experience, incorporating electronic, mixed media, and liberation of sound musics together. He wanted to use music, art, architecture, and writing in one single performance piece. He wanted to create music that was random yet controlled, modern yet old-fashioned, strange and yet fundamentally human. And he left it up to his listener to decide if he ever truly accomplished this feat. The first listening example for liberation of sound and electronic mixed media art is by Edgar Varèse, and it's his poem Électronique. This piece of music was written in 1958 for the Brussels World Fair. He wrote it in collaboration with an architect named Le Corbusier. The piece was written entirely for recorded tape. In other words, there were no live musicians. Instead, he was given a pavilion at the World's Fair in which Le Corbusier built the actual pavilion materials. First, we've got architecture. Then, the two of them collaborated to figure out what types of visual art and writing they wanted to portray on these newly constructed architectural statues and walls. Now we have not only architecture, but visual art and literature combined together. All we needed then was the actual music written and recorded by Varèse. So, in a tape studio, Varèse taped and recorded many different sounds, noises, and musicians. He then used distortion, amplification, and as many types of altering of the music that he could to create a strange and yet interesting electronic poem of musical sounds. He then brought this recording to the Brussels World Fair, put it into a tape deck, and plugged it into 425 speakers stationed all around at specific places throughout the World's Fair. This type of music can never be performed twice because obviously it's a recorded performance with so many aspects that were, once the Brussels Fair was over, taken down and never to be able to be reassembled again. There were unfortunately no photographs taken of the actual setup, and so we really have no way to replicate this piece of music. So when you listen to this, you're going to have to close your eyes and imagine yourself at the Brussels World Fair in 1958, surrounded by walls and architectural interesting objects, as well as writings and art pieces and 425 speakers. And see whether you can really put yourself in that place in your imagination so that you can truly experience the poem Électronique in its most fundamental sense. This electronic poem is an example, of course, of electronic music because it used a tape studio, amplification, and recorded music. It's an example of liberation of sound because it used recorded screams, jets, singing, all sorts of strange things that were altered and distorted by the composer. And an example, of course, of mixed media since it had art, writing, and architecture presented as part of the musical experience. So, listen to this all the way through, imagining yourself to be surrounded by art, writing, and architecture as well as the music, and determine how you feel about it. Some people consider this to be the epitome of new music, and others consider it to be not music at all. Can you identify any of the sounds that he's distorted or changed? Can you identify anything that is musical in this piece of music? Is it actually a piece of music or not? The last composer we're going to discuss is Krzysztof Penderecki. He was a Polish composer and a conductor. He was born in 1933, and so was quite a young man during World War II. He was very greatly affected by World War II and what happened to the people not only on the European continent, but throughout the world, especially in Japan, when the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. His style of writing varied. He wrote for many different instruments, groups of instruments. He wrote in many different styles, many different ways, but almost all of his music strives to capture an audience through shock and emotion. This makes him an expressionist as well as a liberator of sound, because not only did he work to express emotion in his music, but he really wanted to see how far he could stretch normal classical instruments. He wanted to try and make them into new instruments that liberated sound and didn't limit themselves to the normal sounds they created. Penderecki is not discussed in your text other than to mention him and to show a picture of his score, but I felt him very important to know about because one of his pieces of music, his best known, the Threnody to the Victims of Hiroshima, is not only expressionist and captivating, but it really goes to show how far composers were willing to reach in the 20th century to create amazing, moving, affecting music that makes us want to ponder deeper thoughts and philosophies of life and better ourselves as human beings. Take a listen now to your second listing example of liberation of sound, remembering that this is also an example of expressionism, but taken even further than the expressionists of the earlier part of the century. This piece, A Threnody to the Victims of Hiroshima, is a piece about the impact of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, Japan. It's not supposed to be an impression of the event, but a minute-by-minute build-up to the moment the bomb drops. Penderecki portrays this minute-by-minute build-up in the music and its styling. He uses liberation of sound because he uses old instruments and has them played in such strange and horrific ways that he's able to create noises that you will never hear produced in any other way on any new electronic instrument or anything. These are strange sounds that were meant to really pull us into the music and also meant to really honor the deaths of the people in Hiroshima. He wanted to capture the grotesqueness of death and the humanness of the sounds they would have made, as well as the animalistic nature of the sounds they would have made as they ran from the planes. He wanted to shock his audience, and I think he does. This type of music that's liberated in every way really makes us question who we are as human beings and question what it is to be human. How does morality relate to music? How does it relate to being human? And how does it build relationships between people? The example you're going to listen to of this piece actually follows the score of the music. I've given you this type because I want you to understand that this is a true graphics score. This is what the music actually looks like for the performers. It is a timed piece of music rather than being written in a normal rhythmic notation. It is also a piece of music that is graphically represented. In other words, some elements of this music are entirely given up to chance, to the human mind, and to what the performer is thinking about at the time they're creating these sounds. Think about whether you can hear the approach of the droning plane engines. Can you hear the bomb drop? Can you hear any aspect of the music that sounds like the screaming of humans or the despair that they might have felt? He not only wanted to honor the victims of this heinous bomb dropping, but wanted us to think about whether we would ever do something like this to human beings again. He reached far beyond the expressionists of the early period and liberated expressionism to the point where he talked about one of the most horrific events in human history while trying to honor it at the same time. There are so many new ideas of what music is and how to create it in the 20th century. It's hard for us to come to any conclusions about the music that we hear this week. The forms and styles that were developed were all very personalized, and so we all are given the opportunity to like and dislike any of them because of our own perspectives. Composers of the last 100 years strove to control music, to completely free music, and each of us, again, has the chance to let this music affect us in any way we want to. The more seriously you take this music, the more you're going to understand the stories, ideas, and concepts behind the music and the truth behind the music itself. Ask yourself as you listen to the music this week and think back on all of it, and think back on all that we've actually heard already in the class. What is music? Has the definition changed over time, or has it always been the same fundamentally? What do you love about music, and what do you find distasteful? Do you think that music can teach us or affect us in any way? The group discussion board discusses the 20th century styles you've listened to. I want to know your thoughts. I'm sure your colleagues want to know your thoughts on the styles, so try and get on the group discussion boards early this week, especially because you also have your exam. Have fun conversing with your colleagues about what you hear this week and about how you respond to the different styles. The assignment will actually be a review assignment that covers the modern music as well as the 2 weeks on romantic music. It's going to be a multiple choice assignment, just like the last review assignment that you had. It'll be in the same format, where you will be given the multiple choice questions in a PDF document, and then you will be given a Microsoft Word document. All you have to do is fill in the answers, turn it in, and you'll get a 100% on the assignment. This should help you study for exam 3. Remember, none of the questions will be the same, but they are geared and designed so that by using them, you have a chance to really read again the material you're going to have on your test, relearn it, re-listen to the musical examples, and study the correct materials. The exam will open on Monday, so make sure to study both the weeks of the Romantic and the 1 week on 20th century classical music, weeks 8, 9, and 10. Listen to your examples again, read the required reading pages, and the materials from the lectures, because all of that is testable. As usual, remember, once you start the exam, you must finish it, so make sure you have studied before you open and begin the exam. No exceptions. Enjoy this week of listening, and work hard to struggle through this middle of the semester. I know some of you are super busy, so make sure you stay unfocused and get through all of the material, the assignment, and the group discussion board, as well as the exam. Hope you enjoy this week. Next week, we'll be off to more popular styles, the first one being jazz.